bacon grease dripping into a coffee can, feed sack cotton held up to the light for a dress pattern, coffee grounds boiled 3 mornings running. None of it was written down, and the women who practiced it are mostly gone. Here are 30 genius hillbilly frugal habits that save you a fortune. That coffee can beside the stove was the most important piece of equipment in the kitchen, and it cost nothing. Every time your grandmother fried bacon, pork chops, or anything that rendered fat, she poured the hot grease through a piece of cheesecloth into that can and let it solidify. That saved bacon grease became the cooking oil for everything else: cornbread, fried potatoes, green beans, gravy, and sometimes even popcorn on a Saturday night. A family in the 1940s could go months without buying a single bottle of cooking oil because that can never ran dry. The grease carried flavor from everything that came before it, and your grandmother could tell you by the color and smell whether it was fresh enough for biscuits or only fit for seasoning the cast iron. Nobody called it recycling. Nobody called it anything. You just poured it, used it, and poured it again. Before the 1950s, when a family bought flour or chicken feed, it came in cotton sacks printed with patterns, florals, checks, stripes, and solids, because the mills figured out that women would choose one brand over another based on the fabric. George P. Plant Milling Company introduced their Gingham Girl flour in 1925 with dress-quality cotton sacks, and by the early 1930s, Bemis Brothers out of Tennessee was printing florals directly onto feed bags. The Textile Bag Manufacturers Association published pattern booklets in 1933 showing women how to turn those sacks into dresses, aprons, curtains, and children's shirts. Some women formed sack and snack clubs where they swapped prints to get enough matching fabric for a full dress. A mother could sew a child's dress from 2 sacks in an afternoon, and the only cost was the thread. The stitching was tight, the hems were even, and nobody at church could tell the difference, unless they recognized the print from their own kitchen. Glass jars moved through a mountain household the way water moves through a creek, always in motion, never standing still. A mason jar that held green beans in August held sorghum syrup by October and dried herbs by December. Families bought them by the flat for about $1 in the 1950s, but the real economy was in reuse. Every jar got inspected at the end of canning season, held up to the light to check for cracks, and packed away clean for the next year. Mayonnaise jars, pickle jars, anything with a decent lid got washed and saved. Your grandmother kept a shelf in the cellar lined with empties, sorted by size, waiting for whatever needed storing next. Nails, buttons, bacon grease, leftover beans, sourdough starter, rendered lard, every jar had a job. Throwing one away because it was empty would have struck her as strange, the same as throwing out a perfectly good bowl. The jar was never the product. It was the container for whatever came next. Nothing in a mountain household got thrown away just because it tore. When a shirt ripped beyond mending, the good fabric got cut into squares and stacked in a basket by the rocking chair. Over months, sometimes years, those squares accumulated until there were enough to piece together a quilt top. Your grandmother could point to every patch and tell you where it came from. Your grandfather's Sunday shirt, the dress she wore to the church picnic in 1942, a flour sack with the blue cornflower print. She assembled the top by hand, laid it over cotton batting or old wool blankets, and stitched the layers together during the cold months when the garden was sleeping. A single quilt might take an entire winter to finish. It was not decoration. It was the warmest thing in the house. And on the coldest nights, 2 or 3 of them stacked on the bed were the difference between sleeping and shivering. That same stove that heated the flat iron and rendered the lard also kept the entire house from freezing. A single wood-burning stove in the front room, usually a cast iron box stove or a potbelly, was the only heat source for the whole family, and everything in the house was arranged around it. The bedroom stayed cold enough to see your breath in January, so the family gathered in the front room after supper and stayed there until the quilts were warm enough to crawl under. A typical mountain household burned between 4 and 6 cords of hardwood per winter, and the cutting, splitting, and stacking started in late summer. Your grandfather could look at a hickory round and tell you how many hours of heat it held. Oak burned slow and steady, pine burned fast and spit sparks that could catch a roof on fire. You learned the difference by the sound it made in the firebox, the steady hiss of good hardwood versus the snapping rush of softwood that meant someone had been lazy at the woodpile. The women who made lye soap did not follow recipes. They followed their mothers. The process started with wood ash from the stove, packed into a barrel with straw at the bottom and water poured over the top. The water leached through the ash and dripped out the bottom as lye. Potassium hydroxide, strong enough to burn skin on contact. Your grandmother tested the strength by dipping a chicken feather into the liquid. If the feather dissolved, the lye was ready. She mixed it with rendered hog fat in a cast iron kettle over an outdoor fire, stirring for hours until the mixture thickened and saponified into a soft, amber-colored soap that could clean anything from dishes to dungarees. Some women added dried lavender or sassafras root for scent. The soap was harsh by modern standards, but it worked on grease, dirt, and stains that commercial bars could not touch. A single batch lasted a household through the winter, and the only cost was time and ash. Every autumn, before the first frost, your grandmother walked the garden rows and selected the best producing plants: the tomato vine that bore the most fruit, the bean plant that climbed the highest, the pepper that ripened earliest, and saved their seeds. She dried them on newspaper in the kitchen, folded them into labeled paper envelopes, and stored them in a cool, dry place until spring. Families in the Appalachian Mountains had been doing this for so many generations that some seed varieties existed nowhere else on Earth. Turkey craw beans, named because the original seeds were found in a wild turkey's crop, and lazy wife beans, so called because they had no strings to pull, passed from mother to daughter along the same hollows for over 100 years. Seed saving was not a hobby. It was the entire agricultural economy of a mountain farm, and when the old women died or the households scattered to the factory towns in Ohio and Michigan, some of those varieties vanished from the earth like a language nobody wrote down. Cash was scarce in the hollows, but labor and goods were not, and the whole economy ran on the understanding that what you had might be worth more to your neighbor than what it was worth to you. A man with a surplus of corn might trade a bushel for a day's help splitting fence rails. A woman who kept bees could swap a quart of honey for a setting of eggs from the farm up the creek. The general store itself operated partly on barter. Families brought in butter, eggs, ginseng root, and animal hides, and walked out with coffee, sugar, salt, and cloth without a dollar changing hands. In Mingo County, West Virginia, ginseng root dug from the mountain woods brought between $4 and $6 a pound dried in the 1930s, more than a day's wage in the coal camps, and the man who knew where the best patches grew guarded that knowledge the way a banker guards a vault combination. No one wrote contracts. The deal held because your word was the only currency that never lost its value. When the coal companies brought cash wages into the mountains, the bartering slowed, but it never fully stopped. A piece of meat the size of your fist could flavor a pot big enough to feed 6 people, and that was not a failure of the meal, it was the design. In the 1940s, a mountain family of 6 might stretch less than 2 pounds of pork through an entire week by using it as seasoning rather than a main course. A ham hock went into the beans. A slice of fatback went into the greens. The bone from Sunday's roast went into Monday's soup and stayed there until every thread of marrow had dissolved into the broth. Your grandmother could pull a ham bone from the pot, and the meat would slide off in shreds so fine they disappeared into the liquid, but the flavor stayed heavy and rich. She called it making something from nothing, but it was closer to chemistry, understanding exactly how heat, time, and fat could transform a scrap of pork into a meal that stuck to your ribs and kept you full until the next morning. The smell of weak coffee on a winter morning was the smell of a household that wasted nothing. Your grandmother brewed the same grounds 2 mornings running, sometimes 3, adding a little fresh to the top of the old to keep some strength in it. Arbuckle's brand, which ran about 15 cents a pound in the 1930s, was a luxury in the mountains, and stretching a bag an extra week meant the difference between having coffee and drinking hot water. She boiled it in a tin percolator on the wood stove, and by the 3rd morning it was thin and pale, but still warm and still bitter enough to cut the taste of cornbread and sorghum. When the grounds finally gave out, they went into the garden as compost, around the base of the tomato plants and the roses by the porch. The acid in the used grounds sweetened the soil for blueberries and helped keep slugs off the lettuce. Even after the coffee was gone, it was still working. Dug straight into the side of a hill where the earth stayed cool year-round, the root cellar was a Mountain family's underground grocery store. Potatoes, turnips, cabbages, and apples went in after the fall harvest, packed in straw or sawdust on wooden shelves to keep them from touching and spreading rot. A well-built root cellar held the air between 35 and 45 degrees through the winter, cold enough to preserve without freezing. Families stacked corn still in the husk along one wall, hung onions and garlic braids from the ceiling joists, and lined the floor with crocks of sauerkraut and pickled beets fermenting slowly in the dark. Your grandmother knew by smell when something had turned, and she checked the cellar the way a banker checks a vault, counting what was left, calculating how many weeks it needed to last. Sweet potatoes were wrapped individually in newspaper to prevent bruising, and corn stalk fodder bundled into shocks outside the door fed the cattle through January. The day the last potato came up from that cellar was the day the garden had to start producing again. Hog killing day came once a year, usually in late November when the air turned cold enough to keep the meat from spoiling, and the whole community showed up because the work was too much for one family alone. Nothing went to waste. The hams and shoulders were salted for the smokehouse. The sides became bacon. The leaf lard around the kidneys was rendered separately because it produced the purest, whitest fat, the only fat good enough for flaky pie crusts and biscuits. The rougher fat went into soap. The intestines were cleaned, turned inside out, scraped, and used as sausage casings. The head was boiled down for souse meat, a pressed loaf of cheek, tongue, and snout seasoned with vinegar, sage, and black pepper that set like jelly when it cooled. The feet became pickled trotters. The skin was fried into cracklings. Even the bladder was cleaned, inflated, and given to the kids as a ball. A 300-pound hog could sustain a family through the entire winter, and the women who supervised the processing could account for every ounce. Long before anyone called it meal prep, mountain women were threading green beans onto lengths of fishing line and hanging them from the porch rafters to dry. They called them leather breeches, pole beans dried whole on the string until they shriveled to the color of old leather. The method came over with the Scots-Irish settlers who first pushed into the Appalachian hollows, and it survived because it worked without salt, vinegar, or canning jars. Come winter, your grandmother pulled a length down from the nail in the pantry, snapped the dried pods into a pot, and simmered them for hours with a piece of fatback until they turned rich and smoky. Kids sat on the front steps helping thread those beans in August, not knowing they were filling the January pantry. The strings hung like garlands, and when the last one came down in March, you knew the garden was about to start again. Your great-grandmother thought nothing of walking 4 miles to the nearest neighbor and 4 miles back, carrying a basket of eggs to trade. In the mountains before the roads were paved, and in some hollows before roads existed at all, walking was transportation, commerce, and social life rolled into one pair of worn-out shoes. Marvin Green, born in 1901 in Haywood County, North Carolina, did not see his first automobile until he was 9 or 10 years old. Families walked to church, to the general store, to the schoolhouse, and to each other's funerals. A gallon of gasoline in the 1930s cost around 15 cents, but when you earned $1 a day in the timber camps, even that was a luxury. You walked, and your body stayed hard from it, and you knew every root and rock on the path because you had felt them through thin leather. The trucks came later, and the walking stopped, and something else stopped with it that nobody has been able to name. If the coffee can was the kitchen's savings account, the stack of old newspapers was its hardware store. Mountain households in the 1930s used newspaper for things the paper was never meant to do. Crumpled sheets stuffed between wall studs acted as insulation when the wind cut through the clapboard. Flat sheets lined pantry shelves and dresser drawers. Strips soaked in vinegar cleaned windows to a streak-free shine, cheaper than any store-bought product and twice as effective. Your grandmother wrapped fish and game in it to keep the icebox clean, twisted sheets into tight spirals for fire starters on damp mornings, and wrapped Christmas presents in it when wrapping paper was a luxury nobody could justify. In some homes, it served as toilet paper in the outhouse, hung from a nail on the wall. A single Sunday edition could serve a household in a dozen different ways before it ended up as kindling. Before refrigerators hummed in the corner, mountain families built small stone structures over freshwater springs and let the water do the work. The Springhouse kept butter firm, milk cool, and meat from spoiling during the months when the root cellar ran too warm. Cold water flowed across the stone floor, and crocks sat half-submerged along the channel, holding between 45 and 55 degrees year-round, without a penny spent on electricity. Your grandmother walked the path 2 or 3 times a day, and she knew by the feel of the butter whether the water was running right. Some households diverted the outflow to a livestock trough, so one spring fed the table, cooled the food, and watered the animals in a single loop. The stones stayed slick with moss, and the air inside smelled like wet rock and cold cream. When the refrigerator arrived, the Springhouse went quiet, but some old women still walked the path out of habit. When a piece of clothing finally gave out, past patching, past quilting, past every second chance a mountain woman could offer, it still had one more life left. She cut it into strips about an inch wide, sorted the colors on the kitchen table, and braided them tight, coiling the braid into flat oval rugs for beside the bed or in front of the stove. In parts of Appalachia, women carved old toothbrush handles into blunt needles and used a blanket stitch to knot the strips into what became known as toothbrush rugs. A single rug might hold fabric from a dozen garments. Your father's work pants next to your Sunday dress next to a curtain that had faded past respectability. She could point to a stripe of blue and say that was the year your brother started school, or a band of red from the tablecloth at the reunion the summer your grandfather died. Shoes came off the day after school let out and did not go back on until September, and nobody called it a lifestyle choice. It was arithmetic. A pair of children's shoes in the 1940s cost between $1 and $2, real money when a family might clear $30 a month from the coal company. Shoes were for church and school, and if you outgrew them before your younger sibling could fit into them, that was a genuine family crisis. Kids ran barefoot through creek beds, across gravel, and over pine needle floors until the soles of their feet turned hard as shoe leather themselves. You learned which rocks were safe and which ones hid copperheads. A stubbed toe was your own fault for not watching the ground. The old ones still laugh about it, the hot asphalt on the road to the swimming hole, the way your feet toughened so thick by August you could walk on anything. They laugh, but they also remember the relief of that first new pair in September and how they carried them home instead of wearing them. She never called it medicine. She called it what her mother called it, and her mother before that. Sassafras root boiled into a rusty red tea was the spring tonic, meant to thin the blood after a long winter of salt pork and dried beans. A spoonful of honey mixed with chopped raw onion and left overnight made a cough syrup that could quiet a child at 3 in the morning. Willow bark tea eased headaches the same way aspirin would later because it held the same compound the drug companies eventually bottled. The Cherokee had used over 600 plant formulas before the first European settlers arrived in these mountains, and roughly 250 eventually made it into the official pharmacopoeia. Your grandmother knew which roots to dry and which to use fresh, and she passed it on by pointing, not writing. When she died, some of those remedies went with her, because the granddaughters had moved to town and stopped paying attention. Every household that kept hogs had a smokehouse, and the ones who built them right could taste the difference for years. It was a small structure set apart from the main house with a dirt floor and a fire pit in the center. After butchering, the hams and shoulders were rubbed with salt, some added brown sugar and black pepper, then hung from hooks in the rafters above a slow fire of hickory or oak. The smoking took weeks, sometimes months. Hickory gave the deepest flavor, a dark, sweet smokiness that seeped through the meat until the outside turned the color of mahogany. The whole property smelled of it during curing season, and neighbors could tell what wood you burned just by walking past. A properly smoked ham lasted through the entire winter without refrigeration. The bottled liquid smoke sold in stores now carries about as much resemblance to the real thing as a photograph carries to the person in it. If bacon grease was the mountain kitchen's savings account, vinegar was its medicine cabinet, cleaning closet, and preservation vault rolled into one brown jug. Households made their own from apple scraps, cores, peels, and bruised pieces too damaged for eating, packed into a crock with water and a little sugar, then left to ferment for weeks until the sharp smell told you it was ready. That homemade apple cider vinegar cleaned grease from cast iron, stripped mineral deposits from kettles, and cut through window grime when rubbed on with old newspaper. A few tablespoons in cold water settled an upset stomach. Strips of brown paper bags soaked in vinegar and wrapped around a swollen ankle was a remedy passed through generations in East Tennessee. The same jug that cleaned the kitchen floor also pickled the beets, preserved the green beans, and dressed the salad when the lettuce came in. Buying a separate product for every task would have struck your grandmother as absurd. The thought had simply never crossed her mind. When the sole wore through, you did not drive to town for a new pair. You fixed it. Mountain households kept scraps of leather, old tire rubber, and a basic cobbling kit, a curved needle, heavy waxed thread, and a last if they owned one. Your grandfather could peel a worn sole off a work boot, trace a new one from tire tread, and stitch it on by the light of the kerosene lamp. The uppers got saddle soaped and rubbed with tallow to keep the leather soft. Shoes were among the few things a mountain household bought with actual cash, alongside coffee, sugar, and lamp oil, so every month you could squeeze from a pair was a month you kept that money for something else. When a pair finally could not be saved, the good leather was cut out for patching the next one. Throwing away a shoe with usable parts would have been like throwing away food, something that simply did not happen in those homes. In the mountains of western North Carolina and parts of eastern Kentucky, a family's tobacco patch was as good as a bank account, sometimes better. Burley tobacco grew well in the thin mountain soil where corn struggled, and by the 1920s and 30s, a cured pound could fetch between 10 and 20 cents at the warehouse in town. But most mountain families never sold all of it. They kept a portion back to trade directly. A twist of homegrown for a sack of flour at the general store, a bundle of cured leaf for a neighbor's labor during hay season. The whole family worked the crop, from suckering the plants in July heat to stringing the cut leaves on sticks and hanging them in the curing barn. You could smell a tobacco barn from half a mile off in September, that heavy golden sweetness mixing with the wood smoke. The money came once a year at auction, but the trading went on all year long, and a man's reputation in the community depended partly on the quality of leaf he grew. A shirt in a mountain household did not belong to one child. It belonged to all of them in order. The oldest wore it new, or as close to new as the family could manage, and when the elbows thinned, it moved to the next one down. By the time it reached the youngest, it had been patched at the seams and let out at the hem so many times the original shape was a memory. Mothers marked the inside collar with initials in thread, so each child knew which clothes were currently theirs. In homes with 5 or 6 kids, a single pair of overalls might serve for a decade. Nothing about this embarrassed anyone because everyone in the schoolhouse was doing the same thing. The embarrassment came later, when the kids moved to the factory towns and realized that wearing your brother's shirt meant something different in the flatlands than it did back home. Making apple butter was never a one-woman job, and that was the whole point of it. On a cool morning in late October, the copper kettle came out, some of them 40 gallons or more, blackened from years of open fire, and the women gathered in someone's yard with bushels of apples that were too small or too bruised to sell. The stirring started before dawn and did not stop until dark, because if you let the bottom scorch, you ruined the entire batch. They used long wooden paddles with holes drilled through the blade to reduce drag, and the women took turns because your arms gave out after 20 minutes of steady figure eights. The smell of cinnamon, cloves, and slow-cooked apple carried across the whole hollow. Kids played in the yard while the women talked about births, deaths, who was marrying whom, who needed help that winter. The apple butter was the reason for the gathering, but the gathering was the real product. Those kettles sit in antique shops now, priced for decoration. Every roofline in the hollow was a water collection system, whether the family thought of it that way or not. Gutters, sometimes just split logs hollowed out with an adze, channeled rain off the tin roof into barrels at each corner of the house. That water washed the clothes, scrubbed the floors, and watered the kitchen garden during dry spells. Households above the spring line, where well digging hit rock before water, depended on those barrels to get through August. Your grandmother knew the difference between first flush water, the dirty runoff from the opening minutes of a storm that carried dust and bird droppings, and the clean water that followed. She let the first few minutes run onto the ground before setting the barrel under the gutter. Soft rainwater made better soap lather than hard well water, and women who washed with it swore the fabrics lasted longer. When county water lines reached the hollows in the 1960s, the barrels came down and a whole system of reading the sky went with them. You had your everyday clothes and you had your Sunday clothes, and the distance between them was the distance between who you were on Monday and who you wanted to be seen as on the Sabbath. A mountain family might own one good outfit per person, a dress or a suit kept wrapped in newspaper in the cedar chest, brought out for church, funerals, and the rare trip to town. Children learned early not to sit on the ground in their Sunday clothes, not to run, not to sweat in them if they could help it. Your grandmother ironed that one good dress the night before with a flat iron heated on the wood stove, pressing the collar and cuffs until they were sharp enough to cut. The dress might be 10 years old and mended in 3 places, but it was pressed and clean, and she wore it like it cost $100. Pride did not require money. It required a hot iron and the kind of discipline that came from knowing exactly who was watching. A 3-year-old could shell peas. A 5-year-old could feed the chickens and gather eggs without breaking them. By 7, you could carry water, split kindling, and pull weeds fast enough to be useful. Nobody in the mountains debated whether children should work. The farm did not run without them. Your mother did not explain why she was doing something. She did it, and you stood beside her and watched until your hands knew what to do. A boy followed his father to the barn and the woodpile. A girl followed her mother to the kitchen and the garden. What looked like chores from the outside was actually a curriculum. Every task taught timing, patience, and the satisfaction of something done right. The old women say they never had to teach their kids the value of $1. The woodpile taught it. The empty pantry in March taught it better than any lecture could. The grocery store was the woods, if you knew how to read it. Your grandmother walked the tree line in April looking for ramps, wild leeks with a garlic bite so strong your sweat smelled of them for days, and she picked them by the basketful before the canopy leafed out and shaded them gone. Poke salad came up along fence rows in early spring, and she boiled the young shoots through 3 changes of water to draw out the poison before frying the greens in bacon drippings. Blackberries grew wild along every logging road and ditch bank in July, and the kids came home with stained fingers and scratched arms and buckets heavy enough to make jam for the winter. She knew where the black walnuts fell in October and the persimmons sweetened after the first hard frost. Morel mushrooms hid in the leaf litter under dying elms, and she could spot them from 10 feet away while you stood on top of one and missed it. The woods were her pantry, and she had memorized every shelf. Nobody drew her a map. She drew hers by walking it for 60 years. She never once said, "Here is how you do this." She just did it, and you stood close enough to see. The way she tested the oil by flicking a drop of water off her fingertips. The way she pinched the dough to know if it needed more flour. The way she tilted the jar toward the window to check the color of the preserves before sealing them. None of it was written down because writing it down would have meant she thought she might not be there to show you again. And for a long time, she was always there. Every morning at the same stove, every autumn at the same kettle, every Sunday with the same iron in her hand. You thought the learning would go on forever because she seemed like she would. Then one morning the kitchen was cold and the stove was dark and the hands that never needed a recipe were folded and still. You have her jars in your cabinet. You have her cast iron on your shelf. You have everything she left behind, except the one thing you actually needed, which was more time standing next to her. People also used to make their own makeshift DIY cleaning products out of baking soda and vinegar. If you have a cat, You might actually be familiar with this if you've ever dealt with their awful bladder control. Turns out, the two together actually make for a pretty decent detergent, and if you ever find yourself out of some cleaning products or just don't feel like going to the store and you can't order, it's always good to make some at home. It helps you save just a little bit more on the groceries while teaching you a resourceful little skill. When tomato sauce wasn't in the pantry and butter wasn't an option, a surprising combination stepped in: mayonnaise and mustard. Tossed with hot spaghetti noodles and seasoned with a dash of salt and pepper, this unusual pairing became a quick-fix meal known as mayo and mustard spaghetti, which was both budget-friendly and undeniably memorable. Spaghetti itself was one of the most affordable dry goods available, filling enough to feed a family without requiring much else. Mayonnaise, often stocked in refrigerators for sandwiches and salads, brought richness and a creamy texture, while mustard added just enough tang to keep things interesting. It wasn't gourmet, but it turned plain pasta into something that felt like a complete dish without the need for meat, cheese, or expensive sauces. In working-class households, meals like this weren't about following a recipe. They were about making do with what was available. Kids grew up eating it straight from the pot, a quick meal before heading outside to play or finishing homework at the kitchen table. It may not have been a dinner guests would rave about, but for those who remember it, the taste still lingers as a reminder of simpler times and just how far a few basic ingredients could go. Vegetable chowder with milk base was a creamy, nourishing soup made from a mix of inexpensive vegetables simmered in a milk-based broth. Root vegetables, corn, and peas were common inclusions, providing bulk and sweetness while keeping costs low. The chowder was thickened with flour or other starches and seasoned simply with herbs and pepper. This soup was favored in old cookbooks for its ease of preparation, versatility, and ability to feed many with limited resources. Vegetable chowder offered warmth and nutrition, making it especially valuable during colder months or in communities with tight budgets. Its creamy texture made vegetables more appealing to children and adults alike. The recipe exemplified frugal cooking that did not sacrifice flavor or comfort, providing a satisfying meal from humble ingredients that could be varied depending on what was on hand. Also, people would use leftover coffee grounds to naturally cleanse their home of any kind of odor. See, the thing you probably don't know about coffee grounds is that they actually work extremely well as a natural deodorizer. While the appeal of having a mix of every scent known to man being available to you at the tap of a phone is pretty neat, it doesn't really help you get your money up. If that's what you're interested in, maybe you could buy the cheap can of air freshener, keep those windows open, and reuse your coffee grounds before you throw them around. By the way, they make great compost too. Hackberries were known as sugar berries. They would typically be crushed under a person's teeth so that the protein and fat-heavy seed could be consumed. Or they would be ground into powder and added to porridge or made into nut butter. They could also be turned into pemmican, and they were exceptionally nutritious. These bad boys had carbohydrates, fats, proteins, calcium, and iron packed into one. That made them a superfood during the Depression, and one that people always kept their eye out for. Hackberries could also be stored for months on end without being spoiled, and so when people would not have a use for them food-wise, they would barter them or barter the powder, paste, or pelicans they would make out of it. It had an unusual build, too. Thin, sweet skin, a little bit of pulp that you could eat, and a really hard seed in the dead center. It had a nuttiness, but you had to have some dog-like teeth to be able to bite through the seed and crush it. Apple Brown Betty was a classic baked dessert designed to stretch limited fruit supplies while delivering comforting sweetness. Layers of sliced apples alternated with buttered breadcrumbs and sugar, then baked until tender and golden on top. This dessert was especially popular in households that needed to make the most of seasonal or leftover apples, transforming them into a warm, fragrant treat. Apple Brown Betty was economical yet satisfying, requiring few ingredients beyond staples likely already on hand. It was a dish that combined texture and flavor, the softness of baked apples with the slight crunch of toasted breadcrumbs, making it a favorite in old cookbooks focused on frugality. Often served with cream or custard, it provided a touch of indulgence without extravagance. Apple Brown Betty embodied the resourcefulness and warmth that defined home cooking in less prosperous times. During the Depression, it was extremely common for lots of households to be out of detergent. When they would do their laundry, they would instead use vinegar to get rid of any unpleasant odors and soften their clothes. It would help in saving bills because vinegar was a lot easier to get and a lot more affordable than detergent was. Plus, it would last just as long, if not longer. You wouldn't need to take an extreme amount of the stuff anyway, and hey, if it works for cat pee, I think it'll do wonders for a bunch of sweat stains on your shirt. Exotic fruits like bananas became virtually unattainable luxuries during the economic hardships of the 1930s, prompting desperate yet brilliant substitutions from ordinary American pantries. Enter the mock banana sandwich, cleverly disguising boiled mashed parsnips sweetened with sugar and a dash of artificial banana flavoring. Parsnips, previously overlooked root vegetables that thrived in backyard gardens, found unexpected stardom in this culinary sleight of hand. Housewives quickly realized their earthy taste softened when boiled, making them surprisingly receptive to imitation fruit flavors. Banana extract, once used sparingly in desserts, was suddenly celebrated for turning humble parsnips into a believable tropical treat. It's ironic that parsnips were elevated from root cellar obscurity to sandwich fame simply because real bananas became too costly for most American tables. Historical records show these sandwiches appeared regularly in Depression-era cookbooks, praised as creative alternatives that allowed families to maintain dietary variety despite limited budgets. Of course, modern taste buds might question whether parsnips truly captured the banana experience. After all, impersonating fruit is tough business. But many Depression-era children reportedly enjoyed the illusion enough to ask for seconds. Sauerbraten-style pot roast was a slow-cooked, marinated beef dish adapted to use cheaper cuts while preserving the rich flavors associated with this traditional German recipe. The beef was soaked in a mixture of vinegar, water, spices, and aromatics for several days to tenderize and infuse it with tangy, complex notes. Cooking the marinated roast slowly ensured the tougher cuts became tender and flavorful. This recipe appeared in old cookbooks as a way to enjoy hearty, festive meals without the cost of premium meat. The resulting pot roast was often served with gravy and sides like mashed potatoes or sauerkraut, making it a full, satisfying meal. Sauerbraten-style pot roast reflected how immigrant cooking traditions influenced American home kitchens, emphasizing flavor and resourcefulness. Its enduring presence in frugal recipe collections shows how combining technique with modest ingredients could create memorable dishes. Also, buying things in bulk is always very much a good idea. Back then, they would buy lots of things in bulk because they didn't know if it was going to be in stock later. You remember the pandemic, right? People were doing pretty much the exact same thing, but this time, instead of canning offal and meats, we had people scalping toilet paper and hoarding sanitizers. If you took a little bit of that logic and applied it, though, it's actually really helpful. Buying in bulk leaves you prepared, and you'll probably get a discount if you're buying right from a wholesaler. That's when green tomato pie became a clever, last-ditch way to avoid waste and still put dessert on the table. Surprisingly sweet and often mistaken for apple pie, this dish turned unripened tomatoes into a spiced filling that mimicked fruit with uncanny success. Sliced green tomatoes were layered with sugar, cinnamon, and a touch of vinegar or lemon juice to balance the tang. Some versions added raisins or a bit of flour to thicken the filling, and the mixture was tucked between two pie crusts, just like any traditional fruit pie. It was frugal, yes, but also surprisingly flavorful, which made it a well-kept secret in rural households for generations. Not everyone knew what they were eating, and sometimes it was better that way. "Eat first, ask later," was a common refrain when guests took their first bite. With tomatoes too hard to slice for sandwiches and too green to can, this pie reduced garden waste and stretched dessert possibilities during tougher months. You don't actually need to go to Shane for every shopping haul. It's so much more affordable to buy generic brands or local brands from designers and small businesses instead of overpriced thrifted articles that they've either gotten from some really questionable labor or what they've bought from the same people I'm talking about, but are now reselling at, like, thrice the price. It's a death trap. And I like you, viewer. I don't want you falling for it any more than you and I already have. Trust me, you'll still look just as good, if not better. When party food had to be made on a tight budget, creativity took center stage. That's how Bologna cake became a thing. An unusual but surprisingly resourceful dish that turned cheap lunch meat into something that at least looked impressive. Bologna had long been a staple of budget-conscious households. It was cheap, lasted longer than fresh meats, and could be eaten cold or fried. But when it came time for gatherings, families needed something that felt festive. That's where this layered creation came in. Slices of bologna were stacked like a cake, with a frosting of cream cheese or mayo spread between each layer. Some versions had mustard mixed in for extra bite. The final touch? A decorative piping of more cream cheese around the edges, sometimes with a sprinkle of paprika for color. As odd as it sounds today, this dish reflected a time when people made the most of what they had. In an era when processed meats were more affordable than fresh cuts, bologna found its way into countless meals. For some, bologna cake was a symbol of thrift and ingenuity. For others, it was simply a way to put something celebratory on the table when times were tough. Either way, it proved that with a little effort, even the humblest ingredients could be dressed up for an occasion. Mock chicken salad, often made using canned tuna or beans, was a budget-friendly alternative designed to replicate the flavors and textures of traditional chicken salad without the higher cost of fresh poultry. Canned tuna, drained and flaked, or mashed beans like chickpeas served as the base, mixed with mayonnaise, celery, onions, and seasonings to mimic the creamy and savory qualities of the original. This salad was popular in households and church kitchens alike, especially during economic downturns or wartime rationing when meat was scarce. Mock chicken salad could be served on sandwiches, crackers, or fresh greens, making it versatile and appealing. Its affordability and ease of preparation allowed families to enjoy a familiar favorite without straining budgets. Recipes for this dish appeared frequently in old cookbooks, underscoring a cultural emphasis on resourcefulness and making do with what was available. Despite its humble ingredients, this salad was celebrated for its flavor and accessibility, proving that delicious meals did not require expensive components. Then, people were also spending a lot less on dainty, cute little jars off of Temu, Amazon, and online thrift stores. Any kind of packaging they had, they were reusing. Old pots that their grandmothers had, family heirlooms that had been passed down, and all sorts of other nifty ideas. Spending little money on storage was important back then, and it's important now too. As nice as it is to constantly have your phone ringing with a package on its way. Notification, maybe your bank account could breathe a little bit more if you reused a jar or three. One of the most adaptable meals to come out of the mid-century American kitchen didn't start with a recipe. It started with whatever was left in the icebox. That's how poor man's casserole earned its name. A catch-all dinner built on affordability and survival smarts, it was designed less for presentation and more for practicality. If it could fit in a dish and bake without burning, it was fair game. This casserole usually began with a base of starch, leftover rice, elbow macaroni, or diced potatoes, followed by canned vegetables, a bit of protein, often ground beef or even hot dogs, and finished with a can of cream soup or a splash of milk to bind it all together. Cheese, when it made an appearance, was often the last stubborn shred in the fridge. The brilliance wasn't in the ingredients, it was in the concept. It kept grocery bills low, made use of bits and ends, and could be reheated throughout the week without complaint. Even when times were hard, this dish gave the illusion of plenty. While poor man's casserole might not impress a food critic, it helped families stretch a dollar farther than expected. It wasn't just a meal, it was a method, and in kitchens that prized thrift, it was often the week's MVP. Potato water bread was a clever solution found in old cookbooks to stretch precious ingredients while adding moisture and flavor to homemade bread. Instead of discarding the water left over from boiling potatoes, cooks used this nutrient-rich liquid as part of the bread dough, replacing some or all of the water or milk called for in traditional recipes. This technique made the bread softer and gave it a subtle potato flavor, elevating a simple staple into something special. It was especially popular during times of scarcity when flour and dairy were expensive or rationed. Potato water bread required fewer costly ingredients, but delivered a satisfying loaf perfect for everyday meals. This bread could be baked in large batches to feed families or communities, making it a practical choice in households trying to maximize their resources. Its presence in historic cookbooks reflects the ingenuity and thriftiness that home cooks embraced. For many, this bread was a reliable source of comfort and sustenance, showcasing how frugality and creativity went hand in hand in the kitchen. Another thing people would always do was to use scraps for soup. While you might be wondering why we would do this today because we don't have to go that frugal for our budgeting or soup, let's be real. A two-bed costs $2,000 to rent, and that money isn't coming from a minimum wage shift at Wendy's. Using scraps for soup can still work even in our time because we can use it as a way to repurpose leftovers, a lot like what people did during the Depression, actually. Bright, tangy, and effortlessly elegant lemon chicken piccata was once a dinner table favorite. With its delicate balance of citrus, butter, and briny capers, this dish turned simple ingredients into something refined. Italian-American families popularized it in mid-century kitchens, and by the 1960s, it had become a go-to recipe for home cooks looking to add a touch of sophistication to a weeknight meal. Chicken was an economical protein, but before boneless, skinless cuts were widely available, whole birds had to be broken down by hand. Piccata was traditionally made with thinly pounded chicken breasts, quickly dredged in flour and sautéed until golden. The sauce was the star, fresh lemon juice and capers combined with a silky butter reduction to create a dish that was light yet deeply flavorful. It was often served with pasta or rice, making it both practical and satisfying. So why did this dish vanish from home kitchens? Over time, complex flavors gave way to simpler, more standardized meals. The rise of processed sauces and pre-made chicken dishes made from scratch piccata seemed like more effort than it was worth. Corned beef hash with cabbage was a cheap and filling meal that stretched leftover corned beef by combining it with cabbage and potatoes. The ingredients were diced and cooked together until crisped in a skillet, resulting in a savory, textured dish full of flavor and warmth. Corned beef hash with cabbage was especially popular in households looking to maximize leftovers and minimize waste. It was easy to prepare, used minimal new ingredients, and offered a satisfying meal that could be eaten any time of day. This recipe was a common feature in old cookbooks focused on thrift and practicality, emphasizing hearty, no-fuss cooking. Its combination of tender meat, soft potatoes, and slightly sweet cabbage created a balance of tastes and textures cherished by many families. This dish symbolized comfort, thrift, and the ingenuity of making the most of what was available. Back during the Depression, what people used to do was use their backyards and any fertile soil they found to grow their own vegetables. I'm talking about basic crops like potatoes, corn, celery, onions, garlic, stuff like that. It was actually really genius though, and to be honest, as affordable as the farmers' markets can be sometimes, I'm still not really sure why we ever stopped doing that. Don't you think it would save us so much on groceries? Few vegetables can claim to have fed both people and livestock, but Mangalwurzel did just that. This oversized, rough-skinned beet was once a common sight on farms, valued for its ability to grow in poor soil and provide food through harsh winters. While mainly grown as animal fodder, Mangalwurzel wasn't just for cows and pigs. During tough times, it became an important source of nutrition for families, especially in Europe and early America. When boiled or roasted, its flesh turned tender and slightly sweet, tasting like a cross between a beet and a turnip. Some cooked it in stews, while others mashed it with butter, turning it into a hearty side dish. Even the greens were edible, prepared just like Swiss chard. So why did this giant beet disappear from dinner tables? As farming became more industrialized, Mangalwurzel was pushed aside for more refined crops. Its rough, irregular shape didn't fit the modern produce aisle, and its reputation as animal feed made it less appealing. But for those who still grow it, Mangalwurzel is a reminder of a time when nothing went to waste. A vegetable that could feed a farm, a family, and everything in between. Graham cracker pie crust desserts offered a thrifty shortcut for making pies without the need for traditional pastry dough. The crushed graham crackers, combined with butter and sometimes sugar, formed a quick no-bake or simple baked crust that saved time and expensive ingredients like flour and shortening. This method made pie making more accessible to home cooks on a budget or with limited kitchen equipment. Popular in old cookbooks from the 1900s to the 1990s, graham cracker crusts were paired with a variety of fillings, from creamy custards to fruit preserves, resulting in delightful desserts that felt homemade and special. The crust's sweet, slightly crunchy texture added a pleasing contrast to smooth fillings. These recipes exemplified how creativity in the kitchen could produce satisfying results without excess cost. Graham cracker pie crust desserts became beloved staples in frugal households, cherished for their simplicity, taste, and ability to bring joy to family tables. Another thing that people always did was prepare their own homemade snacks. People would make granola bars at home or bake their own little potato chips and corn chips, and it was actually such a nice thing to do because you wouldn't have to take out so much money for literally just 2 or 3 bites of a snack. Plus, these days, snacks cost as much as an outside meal from a restaurant does. It's actually a little insane, you know? Do you know what a jar of Nutella costs nowadays? Isn't it so much easier to just bake some cookies at home and call it a day? Pork belly with cracklings is celebrated for its luxurious flavors and contrasting textures derived from the rich layers of meat and fat found in pork belly. The preparation process starts with scoring the skin and massaging it with a blend of salt, pepper, and aromatic herbs or spices to infuse flavor. The meat is slow roasted at a low temperature to render the fat and tenderize the meat, followed by a blast of high heat to crisp the skin into cracklings. This approach ensures the pork belly stays succulent, while the outer skin turns deliciously crisp. Often served sliced thickly and accompanied by applesauce or a cider reduction, this dish perfectly pairs the pork's richness with a touch of sweet acidity. The allure of pork belly with cracklings lies in the depth of its flavors and the satisfying interplay of tender meat with crispy skin. Hominy and ham soup was a hearty, satisfying dish combining dried hominy corn with small pieces of ham to create a flavorful and filling meal. Hominy, made by treating dried corn kernels to remove their hulls and germ, was an inexpensive pantry staple with a unique chewy texture that absorbed the rich taste of ham broth beautifully. The soup was often seasoned with onions, garlic, and herbs, simmered slowly to develop deep, comforting flavors. This recipe was especially popular in rural and working-class communities where stretching ingredients mattered. The inclusion of ham added protein and smoky undertones without requiring a large portion of meat. Hominy and ham soup could feed entire families on a modest budget, making it a staple in old cookbooks focused on frugality and nutrition. It was a meal that warmed bellies and hearts, reflecting the enduring tradition of creating satisfying dishes from humble components. So, back in the Depression, people used to get really into foraging. That also meant that they realized some of the stuff they were picking up, some of those berries, were pretty good for your skin, and I don't mean after you eat them. People would grind and mix these together to make their own little DIY beauty products. Having skincare like that in times like those was a big godsend for many people, and a lot of people used things like crushed flowers mixed with honey or berries for face masks or hair masks made out of eggs and essential oils. Pickled beets were a common sight in old pantries, prized for their long shelf life and tangy flavor. Home cooks preserved beets by pickling them in vinegar, sugar, and spices, creating a vibrant side dish or salad component that added color and zest to meals. This preservation method allowed families to enjoy the nutritional benefits of beets well beyond harvest seasons. Pickled beets were easy and inexpensive to make, requiring only basic ingredients likely available in most kitchens. Their sweet and sour taste complemented heavier dishes, balancing richness with brightness. This recipe was often included in frugal cookbooks focused on stretching food and minimizing waste. Pickled beets also represented a link between traditional food preservation techniques and everyday practicality. Their continued popularity in regional cuisines and nostalgia for old-fashioned home cooking speaks to their enduring appeal and the importance of resourcefulness in the kitchen. Beaver tail soup has history in several different areas that go back several different long roads. From indigenous peoples to French trappers and European poachers, fur traders, it seemed like everybody wanted a piece of the beaver pie, if not the whole thing outright. Beaver tails are a prized possession in indigenous culture and have been a long-respected part of that culture for as far back as anyone can remember. Now, of course, there's something in it for them too. Beaver tail fat happens to be extremely rich in fat, and a lot of tribes relied on it as one of their most important and accessible sources of energy. Despite what you might think or not think about the little rodent, their tails were also valued for their fur, and beavers fetched quite a decent price on the market. I mean, catching one of these meant you were going to have a good week, but if you caught yourself a few, or an entire bundle, then you were looking at a petty lucrative sum. It's a bit sad to say, but that's really just how it went down. Despite that, beaver tail soup wasn't a source of constant discontent about how they're poaching all the beavers. It was also one of people's biggest comforts. Now, one of the most common uses of beaver tails was the soup you would make out of it. This was an emergency ration, supper, relief in the winter, a medicinal broth, and comfort food all in one. It was a very versatile recipe that had more uses than the next 10 things we can cook up, which is exactly why I think it's worth bringing back. Rice and beans. Burrito Southern style was a simple and frugal handheld meal combining cooked rice and seasoned beans wrapped in a soft, homemade flatbread. This portable dish was perfect for feeding families on a budget, providing a satisfying balance of protein and carbohydrates with minimal expense. The rice and beans were often flavored with basic spices like garlic, onion, and chili powder, making the filling flavorful despite its simplicity. The flatbread was typically made from flour, water, and a pinch of salt, cooked on a griddle or skillet to create a flexible wrap. This recipe was popular in Southern households where beans and rice were pantry staples and bread making was a daily skill. The burrito was easy to prepare in bulk and could be enjoyed hot or cold, making it ideal for lunchboxes, church suppers, or quick dinners. Its frugality and nutrition made it a timeless favorite, showcasing how modest ingredients could be transformed into a convenient and hearty meal. Have you ever heard of using cloth napkins and towels? They might not feel as good as the paper products we're used to and have been familiar with since the, start of our lives, but they do save a pretty penny. The thing is, all of this is a lifestyle choice. These little tips and tricks on their own might not add too much, but you buy the cloth napkin, you make the snack at home, you make a DIY detergent, and you start to see enough money bubbling up in your account at month's end. Eventually. Root vegetables were once the unsung heroes of the dinner table, especially when meat was scarce and grocery budgets ran thin. In that context, turnip and potato hash was a no-nonsense solution that brought together two of the cheapest and most accessible ingredients around. It wasn't glamorous, but it was dependable, and that counted for a lot when the pantry was down to the basics. Turnips, often overlooked today, were valued for their long shelf life and low cost. Paired with potatoes, another reliable staple, they formed the backbone of this skillet-fried hash. Cubed, boiled, and browned together with onions or leftover fat from breakfast, the mixture turned crisp at the edges and tender inside. It was seasoned with salt, pepper, and whatever else was on hand, from garlic powder to a spoonful of drippings, saved in a coffee can. This dish didn't rely on measurements or manuals. It relied on instinct and thrift. If you had a little leftover meat, it went in. If not, nobody blinked. The goal was always the same: stretch what you had and waste nothing. Though turnip and potato hash has quietly disappeared from most modern menus, it once represented a kind of culinary common sense. It made the most of the root cellar and filled bellies without draining wallets, a humble classic forged by necessity. Cabbage soup with potatoes and onions was a filling, economical soup that relied on staple vegetables to create a wholesome, warming dish. Chopped cabbage, diced potatoes, and sliced onions were simmered together in water or broth, seasoned simply with salt, pepper, and herbs. This soup was especially popular during hard times when meat was scarce or unaffordable, providing fiber, vitamins, and sustenance for large families. Its simplicity made it easy to prepare in large pots, ideal for communal meals or leftovers. Cabbage soup was often enhanced with bits of leftover vegetables or grains, making it flexible and adaptable to what was on hand. This dish was a regular feature in frugal recipe collections, exemplifying the principle of stretching ingredients while maintaining flavor and nutrition. Cabbage soup with potatoes and onions was more than just sustenance. It was a symbol of comfort and resilience in the face of scarcity. Whole lifetimes of knowing how to get by vanished when those kitchens went quiet. If any of this brought someone back, leave their name below.